Hi guys, it's Ansi or Anselm von Seherr-Thoss. You know me from volatile training and those websites like from my turbo squid training, etc. I haven't done a tutorial in a minute and I thought I'd get back in the habit. I am not on the computer that much these days because I'm an on-set visual effects supervisor for TV shows and movies here in New Orleans, but I want to get back in the habit, and today I want to do a little bit of Arnold for 3ds Max because I have not seen a lot of tutorials on the matter on YouTube and Vimeo, etc. A great inspiration is Lee Griggs. He works at Autodesk, is an in-house artist, and one of his latest R&D pieces is volume mesh, this right here. And it's super cool stuff. In Arnold you can turn any mesh into a volume essentially, and then displace it, and it's really fast considered what it all is calculating. And I find those images super cool, and I thought I will do a brief tutorial on that. Please acknowledge there is a written tutorial here, but it doesn't have a lot of screenshots, etc. It's very text heavy, so I thought I'll do a video tutorial because I am a visual person. I like to watch stuff rather than read. Here's some of the images I did. I used the skull, a 3D scan, and I'll show you some of the textures I used. And I thought some of those turned out really cool. It works really well with organic textures, like this kind of stuff is cool. There's some render issues, but overall this is super cool. And let's jump right into Max. We have a basic scene with a skull right here. And if we render that real quick, it's really just a skull with a default shader and a render camera. So we're going to use Arnold to render and displace volumes. So we're going to switch to the Arnold renderer, of course. And I keep the resolution at 720 HD for now. And let's create a Arnold light. From the left is good. And let's offset that a hair, something like that. And let's do 50 and 50 as the size. That's pretty good. Intensity, let's give that like a 500. And let's give our skull a standard Arnold material. So we can start. Actually, we can render that as this real quick. And this is our skull. The light is a bit heavy, but we're going to have a volume that has light tracing through it. And obviously, the more light you have, the more translucency and that kind of look you will get. So the first thing we want to do is we're actually going to turn our skull here into an Arnold volume. And in order to do that, you add a Arnold properties modifier, where you have all sorts of general properties. Is it visible to camera? Is it casting, receiving shadows? Is it included in motion blur, etc., etc. Then there's the volume section. If we enable that and give it some step size, etc., let's do 0.05 for now. In the step size and padding, then this skull will become a volume. Now we want to give it a volume shader, volume, standard volume, and let's drag that guy on our skull. Let's render that and see what we get here. It'll take a second, but there you go. This is now a volume, and it's like any other volume that you, like in V-Ray, you would use a via volume grid. You can do the same in Arnold, of course. Lee Griggs, in his renders, he combines 3D scanned people and then volume grids, shoves them together, and camera projects a displacement map so it all looks organic and more harmonic together. I'll just use the skull that I have here and make that a cool volume displaced like image like the ones I have here. The last one I like is pretty cool. It works best with more organic textures than technical textures. The displacement looks smoother. It's all, looking a bit more organic, obviously with organic shaders. Let's ramp up our density to something like 50 because this is a little too see-through. There we go. I will up our render settings once we have something nice going on here. So first, here's our displacement. So in Arnold, you have your own set of textures, bump maps, regular textures, and so on and so forth. We're going to use a bitmap. So general bitmap, and on our desktop here we're going to use a waterphone texture. That's just something I took leaning over a bridge when I was traveling in Europe off a rather fast going rapid on the river, and that is a nice and organic texture that I would like to use here. It's not super big. It's 1600 by 1064 pixels, and this bitmap we're going to plump into the displays of our Arnold material. I'm going to make this a bit more visible here, and let's go. And this is what we get by default, just plugging in this texture. There's a lot going on. We have artifacts and such, but this is essentially a volume now displaced by that very texture. And this right away already looks pretty cool. And where you have your very dark areas, it'll cut off, and where you have your very bright areas, it'll be opaque, and then neutral gray will be the midground. Let's get back to our camera. What I want to do is I want to camera project a texture from the front onto the skull, and then use a bitmap. Because that's what the Lee Griggs tutorial in his text does. So we need a texture camera projection. I'm going to plug that in the displacement, and then our bitmap goes in the projection color. And for the camera, I'll just duplicate our render camera in local world space here. So I definitely cover camera projection. So I definitely cover the entire area of our rendered image. This camera now I pick as my projection camera, and projection color I have the bitmap. So if we now render this guy, we have the texture frontal projected onto our skull. We can lower the density a hair. Let's do 20. That might also help with the artifacts. A little bit, blend it all in together. And you want control over the amount of displacement you get. Now you could go into Photoshop and adjust your contrast and brightness and whatnot. However, you can do that right here in Max if you use a math node and you want to use range. With that, you can basically clamp or increase your in and output of your bitmap, just like you would have a brightness, contrast, or exposure and such. So we take our bitmap and put that in the input, and then this goes into our camera projection. If I just render that now, I will have pretty much the same result. However, if I increase our max output and such, I can manipulate this amount of displacement without touching the bitmap ever. So we can stay in 3ds Max. There we go. I lowered the output maximum from 1, which is default, to 0.2, and now we don't have those gnarly artifacts anymore and get a bit cooler stuff going on here. Let's lower our light a bit. 500 is a bit much, and let's give it some tinted color. So that's starting to look nice, and in the alpha you can see this is all displaced. We can try 0.5. See when we start getting artifacts from clipping. It's right around 0.5. There's some already, so 0.4. Let's try that. It's a good mid ground, and you get some nice displacement on the on your mesh here. Now, however, that this is a projection, if we rotate our skull a bit, we will see that it is projected from the front, so we get those diagonal streaks because the texture is projected frontal, looking from front to back. If you you could link your projection camera to your render camera if you want to animate your camera, and it'll travel with you, of course. Now that we have our standard material, we can of course change our scatter color to give it some more color variation, and play with our settings a bit. But what I suggest we do is we use our texture. Oop, let's copy that back here. The same texture that we use, this bitmap here that is projected, use that as our scatter color, and that way we get some nice color variation. Or you can use a different bitmap. Now we get the watercolors. This is obviously tinted from our light. Let's make that nice and orange, perhaps. Now we get some colors from our bitmap introduced here. I'm gonna keep this not tinted, and let's go back to maybe 400 here. There we go. Now we have a good amount of coloring from our original bitmap. And this is our skull right here. All perfect alpha. The bitmap is, again, is this fluidy, foamy rapid I was just photographing top down. If you want, if your image is too blurry, you can set it to summed area and lower this to 0.33. This is like adding a sharpen filter in Photoshop, and we should get slightly smaller and more detailed imaging on our skull now, and a bit more fuzzier edges because the image is sharper. So that's this this texture. Textures that aren't as contrasty as this, you have rather darker areas, and then brighter areas here from the white water, the foam, with images that are less contrasty, like let's say the tree bark. You want to adjust your ranges to have a little bit more oomph. You can see this is all very gray, which means it's not the volume, or the geometry is not displaced, the very medium gray 128, 128, 128 RGB. But you can see the tree bark kind of marbling through this skull now. So if you want a bit more extreme displacement, you want to mess with your output, you can make this, for example, let's try 3. This will clip in the dark areas, there we go, and it'll cut out meshes. Now we have opacity artifacts here, but you could in Photoshop draw a mask where you don't want any displacement, for example. Just paint that medium gray and it won't displace. But on the right side here, that's all looking pretty dang cool, how the skull volume is displaced here. Let's get that back to 1 maybe. Let's try any of the other ones that I have. The marble turned out really cool. Let's try that. That is a marble countertop texture, and it's just from cgtextures.com. You can pick textures to your liking and play around with this. Let's lower our range back to 0.5 maybe for less artifacting. Then we can play with our density. This is pretty white and densed out, so we can get our density down to 10 maybe. And that'll also help with the artifacting because more light scatters and travels through our volume. But this is pretty cool, I thought. So that is my little 15-minute and then some tutorial. What Lee does different, again, he uses volumes on top of his images and some hand-painted and procedural textures to render his volumes. They're all actual volumes. If they look really solid, that just means he has a higher density, like maybe try 100 for example. Then obviously less light travels through your volume and is more of a solid look. And again, feel free to not only use the same bitmap in the scatter color and maybe in the transparency even. Feel free to just duplicate this whole tree and combine 2 textures and experiment. This is welcoming for experimentation. Let's put that also on the transparency. This is a Starfield texture that I have, and so that is now our multi-scatter through the volume and transparency map using a marble countertop texture as our volume displacement. Again, please experiment. One last thing before I conclude with this is, if you look closely, it's a bit noisy here in the shadow areas. In order to counteract that, right now the volume samples default are 2. I would try a 6 or 8, maybe 10. This will increase render time, of course. Right now we're at about 7 seconds. That is with the recording software and everything running in the background. It should be 10 or less. This will now increase render time, but also make for much smoother surface and shadows. So for your final render in your light, ramp up your volume samples, and now this is much smoother in the shadowed areas. And of course, use multiple lights, use colored lights. Get creative, and there we go. And that is literally it for this tutorial. Again, I am Ansi, von Seherr-Thoss. You can find me on Vimeo and YouTube and LinkedIn and all the above. I will get back to making a bunch of tutorials if I find the time. Probably TyFlow too in the future. And this is it for Arnold and 3ds Max volume displacement. Thank you and bye-bye.